and earth consisting, and compute the magnitudes, this earth a spot, a grain, an atom, with the firmament compared, and all her numbered stars that seem to roll spaces incomprehensible, for such their distance argues, and their swift return diurnal, merely to officiate light round this opacious earth, this punctual spot, one day and night, and all their vast survey, useless besides, reasoning I oft admire, how nature wise and frugal could commit such disproportions, with superfluous hand so many nobler bodies to create. Here Milton frames the Copernican revolution in theological terms, bridging the historical moment as it develops. This poem was published in 1667. To this day we ask the exact same question. Another example of poetry as social protest that testifies to poetry's power is Sam Hamill's Poets Against the War, published in 2003 to protest the Iraq War. It is important to remember he was right about the war 20 years later. Hamill and others were invited by First Lady Laura Bush to celebrate poetry at the White House. However, the event was canceled when the First Lady decided the event would be used to protest the war. From his poem, True Peace: what is true peace? I cannot know. 100 wars have come and gone as I've grown old. I bear their burdens in my bones. Mine's the heart that burns today, mine the thirst, the hunger in the soul. Oddly, this poem is personal, yet it transcends the personal to become a riveting confession of moral importance. Hamill is reflecting on his own demerits as a peace activist in the poem, yet he successfully speaks to a universal position. By asking a pertinent question, why die, he also calls into question the very nature of the soldier's sacrifice to his country, even though he does not mention it. Poetry and art likewise is life itself. Art is experience. In the words of my personal favorite philosopher and poet, Friedrich Nietzsche, art is the proper task of life. The essence of all beautiful art, all great art, is gratitude. How does one remain grateful enough to create art in this age of scandal? With so many heroes and heroines falling from our favor, how can we be grateful for the wondrous task before us of writing poetry? We must learn gradually, importantly, to think for ourselves. Ralph Waldo Emerson says in The American Scholar, "The state of society is one in which the members have suffered amputation from the trunk, and strut about so many walking monsters, a good finger, a neck, a stomach, an elbow, but never a man. Man is thus metamorphosized into a thing, into many things." Poetry is a reconciliation of the individual human with the social being of which such an individual is composed. Through speaking and creating in one's individual mind, we bridge the isolated human figure with others. We branch out. Poetry is written in solitary moments, recollected in tranquility, as Wordsworth has stated, yet it reaches across borders, across nations, across worlds even. Some poetry has even been launched into space. Poetry is often born of conflict. The pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus wrote, "All things come into being by conflict of opposites." Poetry is a yin and yang experience where poesy defines light. It simultaneously casts shadows. Tensions between opposites must find philosophical reunion through deep meditation, hence the resolution of paradox and poetic expression. And poetry is its own space. It defies logic. In the words of Bard Rabindranath Tagore, a mind all logic is like a knife all blade. It makes the hand bleed that uses it. Poetry is the highest wisdom. Its purpose, if we can speak of telos, is to illumine. It may seem senseless to a reader ill-attuned to human emotion, but as the Greek playwright Aeschylus wrote, it is best for the wise man not to seem wise. Aside from poetry's function, there is the ability to create it, to make. Poetry is not a load of nonsense, even though it appears as such at times. The poet, following their obsessions and thrust of language, creates an impromptu gift to the reader. Poiesis, or the act of bringing something into existence that did not previously exist, is poetry's essence. How can the poet create from nothing? Is this not a power reserved for God? Art imitates nature. Nature includes the human experience, and under this banner is all of life. Life, falling from principles of natural law, adheres to certain patterns. Stephen Wolfram, the rogue scientist, tells us all the wonders of our universe can in effect be captured by simple rules, yet there can be no way to know all the consequences of these rules, except in effect just to watch and see how they unfold. This essentially also offers paradigms to determine the rule of poetry. Poetry defies syntax, grammar, and form by its nature. Form seeks to capture poems in their rebellion against order. Words and structure float on the horizon. It is possibility that makes a poem out of necessity. What is the purpose of imitating? If a thing exists, why offer a replication? In Plato's theory of forms, there is a certain figure that represents the good. A table has an ideal table form that guides the creation of the table. The best table adheres to the form. However, a poem shapes reality in a way that suggests power is beauty. It defies Platonic forms, and as Plato himself suggests in Ion, the poet is a winged and holy thing. Divine inspiration fills the poet with tensions and dreams, sustenance for the imagination. Notice the use of the adjective winged. Where does the poet fly, and is the poet a modern Icarus? Well, yes and no. There are no limits to the poet's dreaming. However, the Icarus who falls from the sky is a suggestion of form. Form delineates what is accomplished in the poem. Free verse is an anarchic joy, sustained in Icarine heights. Once the sun is reached, well then, poetry is shaped by limitations. Poetry knows nothing of boundaries and is the freest expression language offers. Let us look at the last stanza of Auden's Musée des Beaux-Arts, which offers an allusion to Icarus. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. This stanza reminds the reader that in spite of suffering, the world continues on. What I consider here is that life is something difficult, filled with sorrows from which we indeed turn away. As Auden reminds us, life simply must be. Art, as an imitation of life, attempts to recreate the world. Create what you will. Can we will away suffering or the limitations of our being? Our being is created from form. The soul is form itself. So the learning of form is the art of reconciling the soul with beauty. Life leaves much for us to desire. Therefore, we recreate life in the order it presents, whereas to sustain beauty. There is an old question about whether we could do without art if life fulfilled our expectations. What then would life be but a mechanical representation of our innate desires? The Word, as Paul Celan says in his famous speech, The Meridian, is an act of freedom. It is the word which cuts the string of the puppet. As Salon elaborates further, poetry as art moves with the oblivious self into the uncanny and strange to free itself. This is art as a kind of primordial temptation. The sublime, you may recall, is built on terror and the grotesque. In order for poetry to be sublime, it fills the void with questions and answers those questions with a kind of treachery. What is meant, you may ask, by art's treachery? Essentially, I am calling art the Promethean flame given to humanity to shape consciousness. This act of rebellion from Prometheus, whose name translates to foresight, grants humanity the right of creation. Our desires and obsessions as poetic dreamers are transmuted into the deep work of art. The primordial ooze seeps from us, thinking on itself. This is fire. Does one play only with fire? The American poet Edward Hirsch writes, "True poetic practice implies a mind so miraculously attuned and illuminated that it can form words by a chain of more than coincidences into a living entity." Can one assume fire from coincidences, this chain, one of infinite possibility that forms necessity? The attunement is toward the universal prospect. What can be created freely, it must be. Although the poet mostly subsumes his or her creations within some aspect of confession, the poem itself must exalt being, in the sense that it reaches into the beyond, toward the abyss, or further reaches, and derives its power from the unground itself. The unground is the space of total possibility. What is defined possibility? Does poetry make anything happen? Can it bring something into life that did not exist before? Language is atomized in the poem, but the poem itself exalts unity and purports originality in such a unity. Thus, it brings new concepts into life through fresh use of language. This is not to say that poetry should not bear some traditional aspect. In the words of Eliot, every nation, every race, has not only its own creative, but its own critical turn of mind, and is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitations of its critical habits than of those of its creative genius. In this sense of tradition, Eliot refers to contemporary consciousness. Each age bears its own bad conscience, in the word of Nietzsche, that is, a philosophical spirit of its own. This springs from problems within the cultural criteria. Aesthetic problems exist for resolution. As I write myself in my essay to the last syllable of recorded time, poetry is the making and shaping of culture. Culture is a voice with pitch and tone. It communicates as a signal. Fluctuations are constant. Wavelengths are dictated by voltage. There are hidden Markov signals within the voice. In this essay, I attempted to prove there is a unity of consciousness and reality. To an extent, I still agree with this hypothesis. Poetry is a unique consciousness. It is presented externally on the page, directly from some hidden aspect of the mind. Its images are derived from the world outside. However, in the truest sense, an object in a poem is not strictly itself. As Samreen Sajeda writes for JaggeryLit.com in a review of Salim Piradina's Final Cut, his poems affirm that imagination has the power to accommodate the universe on a sheet of paper. Piradina's Poetry of Objects in Final Cut demonstrates that an object is more than itself in a poem. It can be autobiography or something asserting the power of contemplation. From the perspective I announced at the opening of this speech, what does poetry do? In my experience as an editor and poet myself, poetry has brought strong community to me. Oddly, writers are mostly solitary individuals. This does not mean there is no need for some kind of community. The internet allows for more communal action on a global scale. Following COVID, events online create the opportunity for greater global interaction. English has also become a central language worldwide, making communications between nations easier. In fact, I've heard it said that Indian poetry in English allows the post-Raj oppressed of India to communicate with the oppressor in their own language. This communication bridges classes and castes in a way that could have potentially instigated the revolutions and riots globally in recent times. Aside from the usual government incompetence to manage crises, the rebelling communities used symbolic speech to communicate their grievances. The oppressed classes have the most creative power. Even according to Nietzsche, who held aristocratic beliefs, creative power is often the benefit and weapon of the classes bearing the yoke, the slaves. Symbolic speech contains power because it maintains an universality. It is poetry itself in a different form. Why are statues overturned, for instance, if not to declare a new era? Even during the American Revolution, statues were overturned to fight the imperial powers. On July 9, 1776, in New York City, a statue of King George III was overturned by colonists in an act of subversive rebellion. I believe we are entering a major new era, and I think you will agree. I also contemplate the possibilities poetry offers in the age of scandal. What is the nature of scandal? Etymologically speaking, the word stems from Greek, meaning snare or stumbling block. It often refers to something harmful to reputation. In our age, it may bear all those meanings. Let's talk about cancel culture, so popular in the American literary community, and how it relates to the emergence of a new era. During this period of strife and confusion, old heroes are being terminated and new ones are emerging. Each hero bears the fall of society on his or her shoulders, in the sense that a statue is a representation of an age. As we stumble into the snares of our troubled reality, as relationships even decay before our eyes because of the lack of personal connectivity so rampant, the breaking apart of social nature, the atomization of society as predicted by Marx, do we anticipate a great sense of communal respect emerging? We revisit our histories. In British Columbia, Canada, a discovery of the mass grave of 215 children at a school used for forced assimilation brought outrage. Outrage is a natural form of protest against injustice. It seems today we find ourselves in the conspicuous position of reckoning with violent histories for which we did not ask. And in the words of the Bible itself, we are visiting the inequity of the fathers on the children. In the process, we will inevitably commit our own sins. In my opinion, cancel culture is toxic because it holds accountability with the morals of the artist through the art, as well as interfering with careers and cultural expression. How can we be rid of this evil of racism and oppression? No one disagrees with this principle, no one in their right mind, that is. However, the method seems suspect. It is often said by nihilists that to create we must destroy. Nietzsche refers to the transvaluation of values as an antidote to cultural nihilism. In Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons, Bazarov is the older nihilist. As we examine the psychology of Bazarov, his family lacks true parental authority. His parents worship him. However, Arkady comes from a family of traditional familial situations. Bazarov's influence on him is seemingly academic. Bazarov meets his end pathetically. This novel seems a cultural critique of nihilism and its sources, namely the lack of solid authority in the lives of the young. Authority does not have to be repressive or forceful. It can also be cultural and or mentorship. Many professors know this authority well, and they probably experienced it in their younger years. Young people, rebellious and challenging of values asserted against their lives, find their own way through this rebellion. As psychologists know, there is a period of striving for independence in a young person's life. This adolescence of the spirit is existential in nature. By existential, I of course mean the spirit of action to create meaning. Meaning is